The wind on the high plains of the territory was a lonely sound. It was the first thing Elias Thorne heard in the morning, and the last thing he heard before sleep claimed him. It was a constant companion, a restless whisper that scoured the land, bent the tall grasses into bowing waves, and rattled the bones of the small cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands. For 2 years, since Sarah had been taken by the fever, the wind and the silence had been his only real housemates. The silence was the heavier of the two. It filled the spaces she'd left behind, the empty chair by the hearth, the cold side of the bed, the hook where her bonnet no longer hung. Elias was a man built of the same stern stuff as the land he worked. He was tall and broad, with hands calloused from rope and wood and iron. His face, weathered by sun and worry, was not given to easy smiles, but Sarah had known how to find them. Now, his reflection in the morning wash basin showed a stranger, a man whose eyes held the same vast emptiness as the prairie stretching out from his front door. He was not a man to wallow. Grief was a private currency, to be spent in the quiet hours before dawn. The rest of the day belonged to the ranch. There were cattle to mind, fences to mend, and 100 other tasks that demanded a man's sweat and paid him back in exhaustion. But the work, which had once been a shared dream with Sarah, was now just a fight against decay. The vegetable garden was slowly being reclaimed by weeds. The curtains she'd sewn were fading in the unforgiving sun. The whole place, Elias felt, was losing its heart. A ranch, like a man, could die of loneliness. The idea came to him one evening as he sat staring into the fire, a plate of beans and dried beef growing cold on his lap. He'd seen the advertisements in the back pages of the Eastern Star Chronicle, the paper that made its way to the small outpost of redemption twice a month. Wives wanted. Respectable men of good standing seek correspondence with decent women of homemaking spirit. Object, matrimony. He had always scoffed at them, at the notion of choosing a life partner from a few lines of ink. It seemed a desperate, clumsy thing. Now, sitting in the crushing silence, Elias understood desperation. He was 34 years old. He was strong and his land was good. But the thought of facing another 20 or 30 years of this hollow existence was a weight heavier than any winter snow. He needed more than a housekeeper. He needed a wife, a companion to push back the silence. The next time he rode into Redemption for supplies, he went straight to the telegraph office, which also served as the town's newspaper agent. He felt a hot flush of shame as he stood before the clerk, a reedy young man with ink-stained fingers. "Help you, Mr. Thorne?" Elias cleared his throat, his voice raspy from disuse. I want to place an advertisement." He'd written it out the night before on a piece of foolscap, the word stiff and awkward. "Widowed rancher, owner of prosperous land, seeks a wife, man of simple habits and honest character, seeks a woman of good morals and a kind heart to share a home. No drinkers or flighty women need apply. Please direct correspondence to Elias Thorne, Redemption, P.O." He slid the paper across the counter. The clerk read it, his eyes flicking up to meet Elias's for a brief, curious moment before he nodded. "That'll be 4 bits. Mr. Thorne, it'll go out in the next mail run east." Elias paid the man and left without his supplies. The ride back to the ranch was long. The shame cooled into a brittle sort of hope. He had cast a line into a vast, unknown sea. Now, all he could do was wait. The weeks crawled by. The wind blew, the sun beat down, and Elias worked. He fixed the sagging porch step and patched the roof of the barn, trying to make the place look less like a monument to grief and more like a home waiting for a future. Every trip to town ended with the same shake of the head from the postmaster. Nothing. The hope inside him began to feel like foolishness. He imagined his small, clumsy words being read and laughed at by women in fine Eastern parlors. Then, one blistering afternoon in late August, it was there, a single thin envelope addressed in a neat, deliberate hand. His heart hammered against his ribs as he took it. He waited until he was out of sight of the town. dismounting by a small creek before he carefully broke the wax seal. The letter was from a woman named Miriam. Her words were as spare and elegant as her handwriting. She wrote that she was a widow from Missouri, having lost her husband in a farming accident 2 years prior. She had no children and no family to speak of, save for a distant cousin. She was a plain woman, she wrote, who knew hardship and was not afraid of work. She did not write of love or passion, but of companionship and the desire for a quiet, respectable life. I seek a good man with whom to build a peaceful home. She concluded, if you are that man, I will come. There was a stark honesty in her letter that resonated with Elias. It was free of the flowery prose and girlish excitement he had feared. It sounded like the letter of a woman who, like him, had been bruised by life and was simply looking for a safe harbor. He read it 3 times by the creek, the paper trembling in his large hands. That night, he wrote back a single sentence on a fresh sheet of paper. I am that man. Please come. He enclosed enough money for her train and stagecoach fare. The waiting that followed was different. It was filled with a nervous energy, a mix of anticipation and dread. What if she took one look at the vast, empty prairie and the starkness of his life and turned right around? What if her plain face was one he could not bear to look at every day for the rest of his life? He scrubbed the cabin until his knuckles were raw. He bought a new calico tablecloth in town and a small tin of coffee that wasn't half chicory. He was preparing his home, and himself, for a stranger who held his future in her hands. The day the stagecoach was due, Elias was in town hours early. He wore his Sunday shirt, scrubbed and stiff, and had trimmed his beard until his jaw felt raw. He paced the dusty street in front of the livery, his stomach churning. When the coach finally crested the hill, a great cloud of dust heralding its arrival, Elias's throat went dry. It groaned to a halt, the horses blowing and stamping. The door opened and a few passengers disembarked, a drummer with a waxed mustache, a stout woman with 3 noisy children, and then She was the last one out, stepping down with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with the frantic jostling of the other passengers. She was slighter than he'd imagined, dressed in a simple, well-worn gray traveling dress. Her face, framed by a dark bonnet, was indeed plain, but it was a fine-boned, dignified plainness. It was her eyes, though that held him. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths was a weariness so profound it seemed to steal the very light from the afternoon sun. This was not just the fatigue of a long journey. This was a sorrow that had taken up permanent residence. She carried a single, battered carpet bag. Elias took a breath and stepped forward, pulling his hat from his head. "Mrs. Miriam?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Her gaze met his. There was no surprise in it, only a quiet assessment. He saw a flicker of something, fear, resignation, before it was gone. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was low and soft, like the rustle of dry leaves. "Welcome to redemption," he managed. "It was a long journey. I trust—" "It was," she said, and offered nothing more. The silence between them was as wide as the prairie. He took her bag, surprised by its lightness. It felt as if it held nothing more than memories and air. He led her to his wagon, helped her up onto the seat, and they began the long, slow ride back to the ranch. He tried to make conversation, pointing out landmarks that were little more than slight variations in the endless sea of grass. She would nod or offer a quiet, "I see," but her eyes were always scanning the horizon, as if looking for something she did not expect to find. She did not speak of her life in Missouri, of her late husband, or of anything personal at all. When he asked, she would give a short, polite answer that gently closed the door on the subject. Elias, a man accustomed to silence, found himself unnerved by hers. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a fortress. When they arrived at the ranch, he saw her gaze take in the small, sturdy cabin, the barn, the endless sky. He watched her face for any sign of disappointment, but her expression remained unreadable. "It's not much," he said, the words an apology. "But it's solid. The land is good." "It is a home," she said, and he could not tell if she was pleased or simply stating a fact. Inside, he showed her the small room that had been prepared for her. It was little more than a space for a bed and a dresser. But it was clean. He had even put a jar of prairie wildflowers on the nightstand. She touched one of the petals with a delicate finger, a ghost of a smile touching her lips before vanishing. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Elias," he corrected gently. She nodded. "Elias." But the name felt strange in her mouth. A borrowed thing. The days that followed settled into a quiet, watchful rhythm. Miriam was a tireless worker. She rose before him, and the scent of coffee and frying bacon would greet him when he came in from the morning chores. She moved about the cabin with a silent efficiency, cleaning, mending, baking. She brought the neglected garden back to life, her hands gentle and knowing in the soil. She never complained about the work, the heat, or the isolation. She ate little and spoke less, but her presence began to transform the house. The silence was still there, but it was no longer the hollow, aching silence of grief. It was a shared quiet, a space they inhabited together. Elias found himself watching her. He watched the way her hands, though chapped from work, were graceful as she kneaded dough. He watched the tension she held in her shoulders, as if always braced for a blow. And he watched her eyes. They were often distant, looking at something far beyond the plains. And when she thought he wasn't looking, a profound and terrible sadness would surface, making her face look fragile as glass. He was a decent man, and his heart went out to her. Whatever had happened in Missouri, it had left a deeper scar than the loss of a husband. He respected her privacy, but a part of him yearned to know what ghosts haunted those stormy eyes. He wanted to offer comfort, but he did not know how to breach the walls she had built so carefully around herself. Their bond grew in unspoken ways. One evening, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, the kind that shook the very foundations of the world. A bolt of lightning struck a cottonwood tree near the creek, splitting it with a deafening crack. Elias saw Miriam flinch violently, her face pale, her hands flying to her ears. He instinctively moved closer to the hearth where she stood. He didn't say a word, but he stood beside her, his solid presence a silent reassurance until the storm passed. She didn't acknowledge it, but after that night, the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease just a little when he was near. Another time, he came in from the fields to find she had taken one of his torn work shirts and patched it with such fine, invisible stitches that it looked almost new. It was a skill that spoke of a life far different from a simple farm wife's. He held the mended cloth, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. It was a small act of care, an anchor in the quiet sea of their life together. He thanked her, and she had given him one of her rare, fleeting smiles. In that moment, he felt a powerful surge of affection for this sad, mysterious woman. He had advertised for a wife, and he had gotten a ghost. But she was a kind ghost, a gentle presence that was slowly, painstakingly, turning his house back into a home. He thought, perhaps, that in time, this quiet respect could deepen into something more. He could be patient. They had been living this way for nearly 6 weeks when the second stranger arrived. It was late afternoon. Elias was repairing a harness on the porch, and Miriam was hanging laundry on the line, the white sheets brilliant against the blue sky. A wagon appeared on the horizon, a dark speck crawling toward them. It was not the direction of town, and visitors were so rare as to be an event. Elias stood, shielding his eyes, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. Miriam stopped her work, her body going still and rigid as she stared at the approaching wagon. As it drew closer, he could see it was a simple buckboard, driven by a young woman. She handled the reins with a casual confidence, her bright yellow dress a splash of defiant color in the muted landscape. She pulled up in the yard, the horse snorting and tossing its head. The young woman looped the reins around the brake handle and hopped down before Elias could move to help her. She was younger than Miriam, perhaps not yet 20. She was pretty, with a cascade of reddish-brown curls escaping her bonnet and a pair of bright, inquisitive green eyes. But as she drew closer, Elias saw the same shadow in her face that he saw in Miriam's, a hardness around the mouth, a flicker of old fear in the eyes that belied her youthful appearance. "Miriam?" the young woman called out, her voice clear and carrying. Miriam seemed frozen for a moment before she moved, wiping her hands on her apron. "Celia," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any warmth or welcome. "I had to come," Celia said, her gaze darting from Miriam to Elias and back again. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was worried sick about you, all the way out here in the middle of nowhere. I told myself, I'll just go for a visit, make sure you're all right." She turned her bright gaze on Elias. "You must be Mr. Thorne. Miriam's told me. Well, she hasn't told me much of anything in her letters." Elias was at a loss. Miriam had never mentioned a cousin named Celia. He looked at Miriam, whose face was a pale, unreadable mask. "Celia is my cousin," Miriam said, her voice strained. "She can be impulsive." "Just wanted to check in," Celia repeated, her smile unwavering. She had an air of breezy confidence, but Elias could see the frantic energy beneath it. She looked like a bird that had flown too far and was desperate for a place to land. Elias was a hospitable man by nature, but this unexpected arrival felt like a disruption, a stone tossed into the calm, quiet pool he and Miriam had created. Yet he couldn't turn away this young woman who claimed to be family. She looked exhausted beneath her forced cheerfulness. "You've come a long way," he said finally. "You're welcome to stay. Rest up for a while." A visible wave of relief washed over Celia's face, so profound that it confirmed for Elias that her just checking in story was a thin cover for something much more desperate. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're very kind." And so Celia stayed. The small cabin, which had felt spacious with 2 quiet people, suddenly seemed crowded with 3. Celia filled the space with a nervous energy, talking from sunup to sundown about anything and everything. The weather, the food, stories from her travels that were vague on details but rich in drama. She was a stark contrast to her cousin. Where Miriam was quiet, Celia was loud. Where Miriam was reserved, Celia was effusive. She tried to help with the chores, but she had none of Miriam's quiet competence. She burned the biscuits, fed the chickens too much grain, and tangled the laundry on the line until it was a knotted mess. She would laugh it off, a bright, brittle sound, and Miriam would follow silently behind her, fixing her mistakes without a word of criticism. Elias found himself caught between them. He was drawn to Celia's easy laughter and the life in her eyes. She would ask him questions about the ranch, her head cocked with genuine interest, and her attention was a flattering balm to his lonely soul. But he also saw the way Miriam watched them. Her expression shuddered, a familiar sadness deepening in her eyes. The peace he had begun to find was fracturing. Yet, in a strange way, the house felt more alive. The evenings were no longer silent. Celia would talk, filling the space around the hearth with her stories. Miriam would sit with her mending, a silent observer, while Elias would listen, feeling a strange and unsettling sense of belonging. The 2 women, so different on the surface, shared a bond that he could not penetrate. They would exchange fleeting glances, conveying whole conversations in a single look. Sometimes, late at night, he would hear the faint murmur of their voices from Miriam's room, a soft, urgent whispering that always stopped if he made a sound. He told himself it was a temporary arrangement. Celia would rest and move on. But weeks passed, and she made no mention of leaving. She settled in, her bright dress becoming a familiar sight against the brown landscape. The three of them fell into a new, precarious routine, a triangle of quiet affection, unspoken history, and simmering tension. Elias, who had sought only a simple companion to ease his loneliness, now found himself living with two women, bound by a secret he couldn't name, and as he watched them move through the small spaces of his home, a harmony began to grow in the strangest of ways. He would sometimes look at Miriam's quiet strength and Celia's fragile vibrance and feel that his small, lonely cabin was finally, inexplicably, full. He mistook the complexity for destiny, believing that this odd, unforeseen arrangement was somehow meant to be. He had not yet learned that the paths of fate are often paved with the secrets people carry. The changing of the seasons on the plains was a subtle thing, marked not by a riot of color, but by a shift in the quality of the light and the temper of the wind, as summer's fierce heat bled into the golden languor of early autumn. A similar, almost imperceptible shift occurred within the walls of Elias Thorne's cabin. The quiet, two-note harmony he had established with Miriam was being rewritten into a more complex, three-part melody, and the new voice belonged entirely to Celia. Celia was like a wildflower that had sprung up in a meticulously tilled field, vibrant, unpredictable, and a little bit wild. Her laughter, once a startling sound in the quiet house, became a daily occurrence. She drew Elias out of his shell in a way Miriam's gentle presence never could. While Miriam communicated in shared silences and small, careful gestures, Celia used words. She asked him about his life before Sarah, about his dreams for the ranch, about the scars on his knuckles and the story behind them. Her curiosity was a balm, making him feel seen and known in a way he hadn't realized he'd missed so desperately. "Did you really build this whole cabin yourself, Elias?" she'd ask, running a hand over the rough-hewn mantelpiece, her green eyes wide with an admiration that felt like sunshine on his face. "A man does what he must," he'd reply, his usual gruffness softened by the attention. "My, but your hands must be strong," she'd say, her gaze dropping to his hands for a fraction of a second too long. He would feel a flush creep up his neck, a heat that was both pleasant and deeply unsettling. He was a man betrothed, in a manner of speaking, to the quiet woman mending his socks by the fire. Yet, he found himself lingering on the porch when Celia was there, inventing reasons to work near the garden where she was weeding. His ears tuned for the sound of her voice. Her words were often laced with a subtle invitation, a hint of flirtation that left him feeling clumsy and boyish. She would stand a little too close when handing him a dipper of water, her fingers brushing his, and the touch would send a jolt through him that left him feeling guilty for hours. He told himself it was just her nature, open and friendly, but in the honest darkness of his own mind, he knew it was something more. It was a deliberate pull, a fishing line cast into the still waters of his lonely heart, and he could feel himself beginning to bite. Miriam saw it all. She never spoke a word of it, but Elias felt her awareness as a constant, silent presence. He would be laughing at one of Celia's breathless, exaggerated stories, and he would catch Miriam's eye across the room. The small smile on his face would falter and die. It wasn't accusation he saw in her gaze, or even anger. It was a familiar sorrow, a confirmation of some sad truth she had always known. The light in her stormy eyes would retreat, the shutters pulled down, and she would turn her attention back to her sewing, her stitches becoming smaller, tighter, more precise. In those moments, the cabin felt vast and cold, and the sound of Celia's laughter seemed harsh and intrusive. The unease in Miriam's eyes became a mirror for the growing guilt in his own soul. He saw her hands still over the bread dough, her shoulders tense, whenever Celia's hand lingered on his arm. A silent, bitter war was being waged in his home, and he was the contested ground. The weather turned in late September. The sky, which had been a clear, endless blue for months, became a bruised and moody gray. A storm gathered its forces on the horizon, a dark wall of clouds that promised a fury only the plains could deliver. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that rattled the window panes and sent dust devils dancing across the yard. "That's a bad one coming," Elias said, standing at the door, smelling the rain in the air. "I'd best check the stock, and there's a loose patch of shingles on the barn roof I've been meaning to fix. It'll let the water in and ruin the winter hay if I don't see to it now." "Elias, no," Miriam said, her voice sharp with a rare urgency. "It's getting dark. The storm will be here any minute. It can wait." "Hay can't wait," he said stubbornly. "It won't take me but a moment." Celia, for her part, just shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It sounds like the world is ending," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. He ignored their protests, pulling on his heavy coat and grabbing a hammer and a pouch of nails. A man's duty was to his land, to his future. The rising wind tore at him as he crossed the yard, and the first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall. By the time he had propped the ladder against the barn and climbed onto the roof, the sky had opened up. The wind was a physical force, trying to tear him from his perch. Rain, driven almost horizontal, stung his face and blinded him. Below, the cabin was a small beacon of golden light, a world away from the roaring chaos of the storm. He found the loose shingles, the wind fighting his every move, ripping at the wood as he tried to hammer it down. He was soaked to the bone, his fingers numb with cold, but he worked with a grim determination. 1 nail, 2 nails. He felt a surge of satisfaction as he hammered the last one home. The hay was safe. It was then that disaster struck. As he shifted his weight to climb back down, his heavy boot slipped on the rain-slicked wood. For a heart-stopping second, he windmilled his arms, fighting for balance in the gale. Then he was falling. He hit the edge of the roof, a searing pain exploding in his ribs, before tumbling the last 10 feet into the churning mud below. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. He lay there, gasping, the cold mud sucking at him, the rain pounding his face. Pain, sharp and blinding, radiated from his side. He tried to push himself up, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, and the world tilted crazily. The golden light of the cabin seemed 1,000 miles away. He was going to die here, he thought with a strange sense of detachment, drowning in the mud just a few yards from his own door. Then the cabin door burst open. A figure, silhouetted against the light, ran out into the storm. It was Miriam. She moved with a desperate, frantic energy he had never seen in her. Her dress instantly plastered to her slight frame, her hair tearing loose from its pins. She didn't hesitate at the sea of mud, plunging into it, her cries lost in the howl of the wind. She found him, her hands searching in the darkness. "Elias! Oh, God! Elias!" He felt her small, surprisingly strong hands under his arms, trying to pull him up. He groaned, the pain in his ribs a white-hot fire. "I can't, my side," he gasped. "You must," she screamed over the wind. "You have to help me." He saw Celia appear at the cabin door, her face a pale oval of terror, paralyzed and useless. But Miriam was a force of nature in her own right. She braced herself, her feet sinking in the mire, and pulled with all her might, gritting his teeth against the pain. Elias found a last reserve of strength and managed to get a knee under him. Together, staggering and slipping, they fought their way out of the mud and back toward the light. They collapsed through the doorway and onto the wooden floor, bringing the storm in with them, a mess of mud, water, and blood. Celia let out a small, choked cry, but Miriam was already in motion. "Get hot water boiling," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that made Celia jump to obey. "And blankets, all of them." She knelt beside Elias. Her face was streaked with mud and rain, her eyes wild with a fierce, protective light. With a small knife she kept for her sewing, she began to cut away his soaked, muddy shirt, her movements swift and sure. He lay there, shivering and weak, watching her, This was not the timid, haunted woman he knew. This was someone else, a warrior who had run into the heart of the storm to pull him back from the edge. She cleaned the gash on his head with a gentle touch. She probed his ribs, her fingers surprisingly knowledgeable, and he cried out in pain. "I think one is broken," she said, her voice tight with worry. "You must be still." She worked tirelessly. She washed the mud from his skin with warm water, her touch both clinical and profoundly intimate. She wrapped his ribs with strips torn from a clean sheet, binding him tightly until he could breathe with a little less pain. She and Celia managed to get him to his bed, where Miriam covered him in a mountain of blankets and quilts. She brewed a hot, bitter tea from herbs she had gathered and made him drink it, holding the cup to his lips. He drifted in and out of a feverish state. The storm raged outside, but inside, the world had shrunk to the warm, quiet space of his bed and the steady presence of Miriam. She sat in a chair beside him, a lantern casting a soft glow on her face. She did not sew or read. She simply watched him, her expression a mixture of fear and a deep, aching tenderness he had never seen before. Celia hovered in the background, her face pale and frightened, but it was Miriam who was the anchor in his pain-tossed sea. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, the fever peaked. He was shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. Miriam placed a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, her hand brushing his cheek. In his delirium and weakness, the walls he had built around his own heart crumbled. This woman, this quiet stranger, had saved his life. She had shown a strength and devotion that humbled him. A wave of emotion, gratitude, affection, a profound sense of connection, washed over him. He reached out, his hand trembling, and took hers. Her hand was small and cool in his fevered grasp. He felt her flinch, a sudden intake of breath, and for a moment he thought she would pull away, but she didn't. Her fingers remained in his, passive at first, then slowly, tentatively, they curled around his own. It was not a lover's grasp. It was something more elemental, the touch of two survivors clinging to each other in the dark. His grip was weak, but it was filled with all the things he couldn't say. "Thank you. I see you. Stay." A single tear escaped the corner of his eye and traced a path through the grime on his temple, and in the flickering lantern light, he felt a bond being forged between them. A fragile thing born of violence and care, trembling with unspoken emotion and a terrible, inevitable guilt. The world was gray and quiet when Elias awoke. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean-scrubbed sky and a world dripping and renewed. The pain in his ribs was a dull, constant ache, but the fever had broken. Miriam was asleep in the chair beside him, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, her face looking exhausted and fragile in the morning light. His hand was still loosely entwined with hers. He gently withdrew it, a pang of something he couldn't name, loss, regret, shooting through him. He heard movement from the main room. A few moments later, Celia appeared in the doorway. She was fully dressed, her hair neatly combed, but her face was pinched and pale. Her eyes flicked from his face to Miriam, asleep in the chair, and then to the space on the blanket where their hands had been resting. Her gaze lingered there. A shudder came down over her expression, her green eyes turning cold and hard as winter ice. She knew, he didn't know how, but he saw the certainty in her face. She looked at him, a long, unblinking stare, filled with a chilling mixture of hurt and accusation, before turning on her heel and leaving the room without a word. The silence she left behind was louder and more damning than any shout. The day passed in a thick, uncomfortable quiet. Miriam awoke and, seeing he was better, reverted to her usual reserved self, though she moved with a new gentleness around him. Celia was a ghost. She performed her chores with a rigid, angry efficiency, her movements jerky, clattering plates and slamming cupboards. She refused to meet Elias's eyes, and she spoke to no one. The easy, vibrant energy she had brought into the cabin was gone. replaced by a sullen, brooding presence that soured the air. That evening, the tension finally snapped. Elias was propped up in his chair by the fire, his ribs aching, feeling like a prisoner in his own home. Miriam was preparing a thin broth. Celia, who had been unnaturally still for an hour, suddenly stood up, walked to the small cabinet where Elias kept a bottle of whiskey for medicinal purposes, and poured a generous amount into a tin cup. Miriam stopped stirring, her back rigid. "Celia, don't—" Celia ignored her, taking a long, defiant swallow. She grimaced as the raw spirit hit her throat, then took another. She walked over to the hearth and stood before Elias, the cup dangling from her fingers. "You look a little better, Elias," she said, her voice overly bright, but with a hard edge he'd never heard before. "A little fall can't keep a strong man down for long, can it?" Elias shifted, uncomfortable. "I'm mending." "Of course you are," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. She took another drink. "You have such good care. After all, the best a man could ask for." Her gaze slid meaningfully toward Miriam. "A man gets lonely out here. A man needs warmth, companionship. It's a cold bed, alone on the prairie." The words hung in the air, thick and suggestive. Elias felt a hot blush of shame and anger. He didn't know what to say. He was trapped by his weakness, by his guilt, by the unspoken truths that ricocheted between the two women. "That's enough," Miriam said, her voice low and trembling with rage. She put the spoon down with a sharp clink. "Is it?" Celia shot back, whirling to face her. "Is it enough, Miriam? Or is it just the beginning?" "Stop this, you're not yourself." "Oh, I think for the first time in a long time, I am exactly myself." Celia's voice rose, cracking with emotion and whiskey. "You can't just hide from the world out here and pretend. You can't just—" "Be quiet," Miriam hissed, her face ashen. She took a step toward her cousin, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. It was the first time Elias had ever heard them raise their voices. The sound was shocking, a violation of the house's fragile peace. He saw years of resentment, fear, and some dark, shared history boiling to the surface in their eyes. He pushed himself up in his chair, pain shooting through his side. "That's enough, both of you," he commanded, his voice a hoarse rasp. The sound of his voice broke the spell. Instantly, the two women froze. They looked at him, then at each other. The fire went out of Celia's eyes, replaced by a familiar, hunted look. Miriam's face became a stony, impassive mask. The storm was over as quickly as it had begun. Without another word, Celia slammed the tin cup down on the mantelpiece and fled into the room she shared with Miriam, closing the door firmly behind her. Miriam stood for a long moment, her back to Elias, her shoulders shaking slightly. Then she took a deep, shuddering breath, visibly composing herself. She picked up the spoon and began to stir the broth again, as if nothing had happened. But the air in the cabin was thick and poisoned with unspoken words, with the wreckage of the night's turbulent emotions. Elias leaned back, his body throbbing with pain, his mind reeling. He had sought a wife to cure his loneliness, and in his foolishness, he had invited a tempest into his home, a tempest with two faces, bound by a secret he was now certain he could no longer afford to ignore. The silence that followed the storm was of a different kind. It was not the companionable quiet Elias had once shared with Miriam, nor the empty, grieving silence he had known after Sarah's death. This was a brittle, watchful silence, heavy with the things that had been screamed and the far worse things that had been left unsaid. The three of them moved through the small cabin like ghosts in a play, performing the motions of living, stoking the fire, preparing meals, mending clothes. But the heart had gone out of it. Every clink of a fork on a plate was an explosion, every cleared throat a momentous speech. Elias's ribs healed with a slow, grinding pain, but the injury to the peace of his home felt far more grievous. He was a captive in his own chair by the hearth, forced to watch the silent, agonizing dance between the two women. Celia's vibrant energy had curdled into a sullen resentment. She moved with a rigid anger, her back always turned, her answers to his questions clipped and cold. Miriam had retreated so far into herself that she seemed to fade into the very walls of the cabin. She was a phantom of quiet duty, her face pale and drawn, her eyes fixed on her sewing as if the fate of the world depended on a single, perfect stitch. The bond between them, the one he had once found curious and faintly reassuring, now seemed menacing. He began to dissect it in his mind, replaying every shared glance, every whispered, late-night conversation he had overheard. It was not the simple familiarity of cousins. There was a desperation there, a fierce, primal connection forged in a fire he couldn't comprehend. He saw it in the way Miriam's eyes would follow Celia, a look of profound pain and a terrifying protectiveness. He saw it in the way Celia, even in her anger, would sometimes look at Miriam when she thought no one was watching, her expression a complex storm of love, resentment, and a deep, abiding reliance. They were more than kin. They were two halves of a secret, and he was the unwelcome outsider. The word sisters formed in his mind, and it felt truer than cousin, but even that didn't seem to capture the sheer, desperate gravity of their bond. Nearly a month after the storm, his ribs had knitted enough for him to make the ride into redemption. The journey was a welcome respite. The vast, empty prairie felt clean and honest compared to the suffocating atmosphere of the cabin. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed distance. He needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with unspoken accusations and ancient sorrows. He collected his mail from the post office last, as was his habit. There were a few circulars and a month-old newspaper. Tucked between them was a plain, unmarked envelope, addressed to him in a tight, pinched script that seemed to have been written with a needle rather than a pen. There was no return address. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. It felt wrong. He waited until he was on the ride home, stopping by the same creek where he had first read Miriam's letter. The irony was not lost on him. He opened the envelope. The single sheet of paper inside was cheap and thin. The message was brief, anonymous, and steeped in malice. "Mr. Thorne," it began, the letters sharp and angry. "A man should know the character of the women under his roof. You think you have taken in a grieving widow and her sweet cousin. Ask them about St. Louis. Ask them about a certain refuge for soiled doves run by a woman named Madame Evangeline. You are a fool being played by two clever actresses who are well versed in the art of pleasing men. They will ruin your name as they have ruined their own." The words blurred before his eyes. Soiled doves. The ugly, euphemistic phrase struck him like a physical blow. He read the letter again, and then a third time, as if the words might change. His first instinct was a hot surge of protective anger. It was a lie. Vicious town gossip from some jealous soul. He thought of Miriam, her quiet dignity, her tireless work, her gentleness. He thought of her running into the storm to save him. The woman described in this letter was not the woman he knew. But then, the doubts began to creep in, cold and insidious as a winter draft. He thought of her profound, unrelenting sadness, her refusal to speak of the past. He thought of Celia's sudden arrival, her desperate need for a safe harbor disguised as a casual visit. He thought of the look in her eyes, a hardness that no innocent young woman should possess. He remembered the fight, the raw, venomous words that hinted at a past far darker than a simple life in Missouri. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture so ugly he could barely stand to look at it. The letter was not the source of the poison. It was merely giving it a name. He sat by the creek for over an hour, the cruel letter in his hand, the clean prairie air doing nothing to clear the sickness in his soul. He was caught between the quiet trust he had built with Miriam and the horrifying possibility that his entire world was a carefully constructed lie. By the time he mounted his horse and turned for home, he knew he had no choice. The silence had to be broken, no matter how much damage the truth might cause. He found Miriam in the barn, milking the cow. The air was warm and smelled of hay and animals, a scent that had always been a comfort to him. Today, it felt like the setting for an execution. She looked up as he entered, her hands moving in their steady, rhythmic way. She offered him a small, hesitant smile, the first he had seen from her in weeks. It nearly broke his heart. He didn't return it. He couldn't. He walked toward her, his boots heavy on the straw-strewn floor. He stopped a few feet away, holding the letter. "Miriam," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "We need to talk." She saw the look on his face, the grim set of his jaw, and the small smile vanished. The familiar look of fear, the one she wore like a second skin, returned to her eyes. Her hands stilled on the cow. "What is it, Elias?" He held out the letter. "I received this in town today." She did not take it. She simply stared at the folded paper in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. She didn't need to read it. She knew. Her face, already pale, lost the last of its color, turning a stark, bloodless white. Who sent it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't say," he said, his voice flat. "It speaks of St. Louis, of a place, a house, run by a Madame Evangeline." A sound escaped her lips, a small, broken gasp, like an animal caught in a trap. Her eyes, those stormy gray pools of sorrow, filled with a terror so profound that Elias felt his own anger waver, replaced by a terrible pity. "Miriam," he pressed, his voice softer now, pleading. "Tell me it's a lie." She shook her head, a slow, agonizing movement. Her whole body began to tremble. "I can't," she whispered. The simple, devastating admission hung in the warm air between them. The barn, which had felt like his sanctuary, his domain, now felt like a confessional. He saw her fortress of silence, the one he had so patiently respected, crumble into dust before his eyes. She looked at him, her gaze raw with a shame so deep it seemed to scorch the very air. And then she broke. The rigid control she maintained at all times shattered, and she began to weep. It was not a gentle crying. It was a storm of grief, a raw, ragged sound torn from the deepest parts of her soul, as if years of unshed tears were finally breaking free. She sank to her knees on the dirty straw, her body racked with sobs that seemed to tear her apart. Elias stood frozen for a moment, the letter falling from his numb fingers. All the anger, all the suspicion, was washed away by the sheer force of her agony. He knelt in front of her, his own heart aching. He didn't touch her. He just waited. It was a long time before the storm passed, leaving her limp and shuddering. She finally looked up at him, her face ravaged, her eyes red and swollen. "We were just girls," she began, her voice a hoarse, broken whisper. "Our parents died of the lung fever in the same winter. There was no one, just me and Celia. I was 16. She was barely 14. She paused, gathering her strength, her eyes looking past him, back into the nightmare of her memory. "A man came through our town. He was handsome, well-dressed. He said he was an agent for a large seamstress company in St. Louis. He said they were looking for good girls with nimble fingers. He promised us honest work, a room of our own, food on the table. It was like a prayer being answered." Her voice caught on a sob. "He was so kind to us on the journey. He bought us ribbons for our hair. He told us we had a bright future. We believed him. We were children. We had no reason not to." She closed her eyes, as if she couldn't bear the image of what came next. The house wasn't a seamstress shop. It was beautiful on the outside, with gas lights and a painted door. Inside, it was a cage. A pretty cage with red velvet curtains and gilded mirrors. But a cage all the same. Madame Evangeline. She took our traveling clothes and gave us other things to wear. She told us our old lives were over. She told us we belonged to her now, and that we would learn to please the gentleman who came to call. Elias felt a cold, hard knot of rage form in his stomach. He pictured them, two orphaned girls, alone and terrified, their hope turning to horror. Miriam's voice dropped lower, thick with shame. I tried to fight. I told her we were good girls. She laughed. She had me locked in a cellar room for 3 days with nothing but water. When I came out, I was quieter. But Celia, she was so young, so fragile. She would cry at night until she made herself sick. The men, some of them liked that. They liked the fear in her eyes. The rage in Elias's chest burned hotter. He wanted to find the man who had done this, the woman who had caged them, and break them with his bare hands. I tried to protect her, Miriam continued, her gaze finding his, pleading for him to understand. I did everything I could. I took the cruelest men for myself. If I could, I tried to build a wall around her, but it wasn't enough. There was one man, a regular visitor. He was powerful in the city, and he wanted Celia. He was rough. He hurt her. One night, he came upstairs, drunker than usual. He was angry. He dragged Celia into a room and locked the door. I could hear her screaming. She was trembling violently now, reliving it. Something inside me broke. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't. I broke the door down. He was on top of her. He had his hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, staring at me. I saw the light in them going out, and I acted. She stared at her own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. There was a heavy porcelain water pitcher on the washstand. I grabbed it. I didn't think. I just hit him, over and over. There was a terrible sound, and then a terrible stillness. He just fell away from her. Elias was deathly still. He felt the weight of her words settle over him, heavy as a shroud. He was dead, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I had killed him. We knew they would hang me for it. They wouldn't care why I'd done it. We were nothing to them. We took what little money we could find in his pockets. And we ran. We just ran. The full, horrifying truth was laid bare in the dusty air of the barn. We've been running ever since, she said, her voice faint with exhaustion. For 5 years, working odd jobs, always looking over our shoulders, changing our names. We could never stay in one place for long. I saw your advertisement. It seemed like the end of the earth, a place where no one could ever find us, a place where Celia could be safe. It was our last hope. Elias, our very last hope. The story was over. She was empty, her confession leaving her hollowed out. Elias looked at her, this woman he thought he knew, and saw a stranger, a survivor, a killer, a fierce protector who had been to hell and back to save the person she loved most in the world. The pity he felt was so immense it was painful. It was mixed with a profound, aching respect, and something else, too. Something that felt terrifyingly like love. He finally understood. He understood the sorrow, the fear, the unbreakable bond. They weren't just cousins or sisters. They were the only two survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the same piece of wreckage in a hostile sea. The weight of it all pressed down on him, crushing him. His simple life, his simple request for a wife, had become impossibly complex. He had 2 women in his home, 2 victims who had stolen his heart in different ways, and one of them was a killer. He didn't know how long they knelt there in the straw. Finally, Miriam stirred. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and slowly got to her feet, her movements stiff and old. I will leave, she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. I will not bring this trouble to your door. I'll pack my things. Celia can stay, if you'll have her. She's a good girl. She deserves a chance at a real life. She was offering to sacrifice herself, just as she always had, to disappear into the wilderness to keep Celia safe. Elias got to his feet, his own legs unsteady. The thought of her leaving, of her facing the world alone again, sent a shard of ice through his heart. Before he could answer, another voice spoke from the barn doorway. No! Celia stood there, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. She had clearly heard everything. She walked past Elias and stood beside Miriam, taking her hand. It was an act of unwavering solidarity. She turned to face Elias. If anyone leaves, it should be her. She carries the bigger burden. Her words were cruel, but her grip on Miriam's hand was tight. Then, her gaze softened, turning pleading. Or, Elias, you could send her away. Marry me. I'll be a good wife to you. I swear it. I'll make you happy. We can be safe here, a real family. Just the two of us. The choice was laid before him, stark and impossible. Miriam, offering to vanish into the shadows to protect him and her sister. Celia, offering him a life, a future, if he would only cut away the tainted part of their past. Elias looked from one woman to the other. He looked at Miriam's quiet, wounded strength, the deep, abiding loyalty that had led her to commit the most terrible of acts. He looked at Celia's desperate, vibrant will to live, her fierce desire for the safety and normalcy that had been stolen from her. He had wanted a wife. Now he had to choose between two souls, both of whom he cared for deeply. To choose Miriam would be to accept a killer into his home, to live forever in the shadow of her past. To choose Celia would be to cast Miriam out, to abandon the woman who had saved his life and sacrificed everything. It felt like being asked to choose which of his own hands to sever. His heart, which had been lonely for so long, was now split in two, torn by a decision he had never imagined and a love he didn't know how to define. The prairie outside was vast and silent, offering no answers. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone with an impossible choice. The confession in the barn did not break the dam. It merely revealed the vast, dark reservoir of pain that lay behind it. In the days that followed, the truth did not bring relief, only a different, more agonizing kind of tension. The impossible choice Elias faced was a physical presence in the cabin, sitting between them at the dinner table, lying between them in the long, sleepless nights. He was paralyzed. To choose was to condemn, and his soul recoiled from the judgment. So he did nothing, and in his inaction, the house became a purgatory. Miriam was quieter than ever, but her silence was now imbued with a terrible knowledge. She had laid her soul bare, and now she waited for the verdict. She performed her duties with a mechanical precision, her eyes downcast, as if the shame of her past was a physical weight bending her neck. Celia was a storm cloud, radiating a sullen, desperate energy. She watched Elias constantly, her green eyes a mixture of pleading and accusation, her offer to be his wife hanging in the air between them like an unsheathed blade. The three of them were trapped, not by the walls of the cabin, but by the jagged edges of their shared trauma. Elias felt himself being ground down between the two millstones of their separate, yet intertwined, suffering. His compassion for them was a fire in his gut, but it was a fire that gave no light, only a searing, directionless heat. One night, the prairie was bathed in the cold, unforgiving light of a full moon. The world outside was silent, vast, and frozen in silver. Sleep would not come to Elias. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, the faces of the two women floating in the darkness behind his eyes. He heard the soft creak of a floorboard in the main room, a sound so faint he thought he might have imagined it. Then, a shadow fell across his doorway. It was Celia. She wore a simple white nightgown, her reddish-brown hair unbound and tumbling over her shoulders. In the moonlight slanting through his small window, she looked ethereal, a ghost of the vibrant girl she tried to be. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you awake?" He sat up slowly, his heart beginning a low, heavy drumbeat. "Celia, what is it? What's wrong?" She drifted into the room, closing the door softly behind her. She didn't come toward the bed, but stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the stark, moonlit landscape. "I can't sleep," she said. "I keep thinking about what happens next, about where we go from here." He had no answer for her. He had no answers for himself. She told you everything, didn't she? Celia asked, her back still to him. In the barn, I heard. She told you about St. Louis. She did, Elias said, his voice rough. Celia wrapped her arms around herself, as if warding off a sudden chill. She didn't tell you the worst of it. She couldn't. She always takes the worst of it on herself. She turned from the window, her face a pale, tragic mask in the moonlight. She didn't tell you what it was like for me? The first time? Elias felt a cold dread creep through him. He didn't want to hear this. He had to hear this. She began to speak, her voice low and flat, stripped of all its usual life. She told him of being 14, of the terror and the confusion. She spoke of the cheap satin dress that scratched her skin, of the smell of stale cigar smoke and spilled whiskey that clung to the velvet curtains. She described the man, his damp, fleshy hands, the gold tooth that glinted when he smiled, a smile that held no warmth, only a predatory hunger. I didn't understand what he wanted, not at first, she whispered, her gaze fixed on some horrible point in the past. I just knew I was afraid. I started to cry, and Madame Evangeline, she slapped me. She said gentlemen don't pay for tears unless they ask for them. She pushed me into the room and locked the door. She was no longer in his room. She was back in that gilded cage, a terrified child. Elias could almost see it, smell it. He hurt me, she said, her voice catching on a sob. And when it was over, I just lay there. I felt broken, smashed into pieces, like a doll that had been torn apart. And I thought, this is my life now. This is all I will ever be. She fell silent, her shoulders shaking. Elias felt a profound and helpless rage, a desire to ride back in time and tear that world apart with his bare hands. But then, Celia continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. The door opened. It was Miriam. She must have been waiting outside the whole time. She didn't say a word. She just came in, and she had a basin of warm water and a cloth. She washed my face. She helped me out of that awful dress. She held me. She just held me all night, humming a little song our mother used to sing. She didn't sleep. She just held me, and she kept whispering, I'm here. I won't let them break you. I'm right here. Tears were streaming down Celia's face now, silver tracks in the moonlight. Every time, after that, every time a man hurt me, she was there. She would wait. She would put me back together. She took the beatings that were meant for me. She went with the cruelest men so they would leave me alone. She was my shield, the only thing that kept me from shattering completely. She took a shuddering breath. When she killed that man, it was for me. He had cornered me. He said he was going to take me with him, that I was his property now. I saw the look in his eyes, and I knew he meant to kill me when he was done. And Miriam saw it too. She saved my life. Elias, she threw her own away to save mine. The story hung in the silent room, a testament to a love and sacrifice so fierce it defied comprehension. Celia crossed the room and sank to her knees beside his bed, her story finally breaking her. She buried her face in the rough blanket, her body racked with deep, gut-wrenching sobs. It was the sound of a pain so old and so deep it would never truly heal. Without thinking, Elias reached out and put a hand on her trembling back. He could feel the fragile bones of her shoulders, the violent shudder of her grief. He was overwhelmed by a wave of compassion so powerful it felt like drowning. She was not a temptress. She was not a rival for his affection. She was a casualty of a brutal war, a wounded soldier who had never known a moment of peace. She looked up at him, her face ravaged with tears, her green eyes filled with a desperate, pleading loneliness. She leaned into his touch, a silent plea for comfort, for warmth, for one moment of human kindness in the cold, dark night. And in that moment, the lines blurred. The careful boundaries he had tried to maintain between them dissolved. Pity bled into affection. Compassion mingled with a long-repressed physical loneliness. He pulled her up, and she came into his arms without hesitation. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, whispering meaningless words of comfort. She clung to him, her tears soaking his shirt, her body pliant and yielding against his. The air grew thick with a volatile mixture of sorrow and desire. It was the scent of two lonely, wounded people finding a fleeting solace in the darkness. He was her protector, her confessor, and in that moment, something more. The cold moonlight watched, impassive, as they crossed a line from which there would be no return. Their coming together was not an act of passion, but of desperation, a quiet, mournful collision of shared pain and profound, aching need. The next morning, the sun rose into a clear, mercilessly bright sky. When Elias entered the main room, Miriam was already there, stoking the fire. She did not look at him, but he felt her gaze on him all the same, an almost physical touch. Celia emerged a few moments later, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She could not look at either of them, busying herself with setting the table, her movements clumsy and loud in the thick silence. Miriam turned from the hearth, a pot of coffee in her hand. She looked first at Celia's face, then at Elias's. She didn't need to ask. She didn't need to be told. Her eyes, those stormy gray seas, saw everything. There was no anger in them, no accusation. There was something far worse, a deep, knowing sorrow, a profound and weary resignation, as if she had expected this all along. It was the look of a woman who had been betrayed by the world so many times that one more betrayal was simply a confirmation of life's cruel logic. She said nothing. She simply poured the coffee, her hand perfectly steady, and the silence in the room became a scream. Elias couldn't bear it. He couldn't bear the weight of Miriam's silent understanding or Celia's averted shame-filled gaze. He felt like a traitor, a hypocrite. He mumbled something about needing to check a fence line on the far side of the property, grabbed his hat, and fled the cabin. But he didn't ride toward the fences. He turned his horse toward redemption. He wasn't running to something. He was running away. From the two women. From the mess he had made. From the man he saw in their eyes. The town was a welcome distraction, its ordinary bustle a relief from the hothouse intensity of the cabin. He bought supplies he didn't need, spoke to men about the price of cattle, trying to lose himself in the mundane. As he was leaving the mercantile, a commotion from the direction of the saloon drew his attention. A small crowd had gathered, shouts, ugly and sharp, cut through the air. Elias moved closer. His curiosity piqued. In the center of the circle, two rough-looking drovers had cornered a smaller man, a blacksmith's assistant named Peterson. They were shoving him back and forth, their faces contorted with self-righteous rage. "Think you're better than us, Peterson?" one of them snarled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the man's boots. "Just leave him be," a woman in the crowd muttered, but no one moved to help. "I don't want any trouble," Peterson said, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Bit late for that," the second drover sneered. "We saw you, giving that piece of meat from the cat house your business, and then giving her a kind word. Too, a man like you, encouraging that kind of filth in our town." "She was just buying medicine," Peterson protested. "Her kid's sick. I was just holding the door for her." The first drover laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Holding the door for a whore! You're just as tainted as she is!" He shoved Peterson hard, sending him stumbling backward into a horse trough. And in that moment, Elias saw it all with a blinding, terrible clarity. He wasn't looking at Peterson and some nameless, scorned woman. He was looking at Miriam and Celia. He was looking at their future. He saw the town, this collection of supposedly decent folk, and he understood that their judgment was absolute and eternal. There was no statute of limitations on their kind of sin. A woman who had been forced into that life was forever marked, forever tainted, and any man who showed her a moment of simple human kindness was guilty by association, worthy of the same contempt. Society would never forgive them. The world would never let them be anything other than what they had been forced to be. They could run to the ends of the earth, but their past would always follow, whispered on the wind by anonymous letters and spat from the mouths of cruel, self-righteous men. They would never be safe, unless he made them safe. A cold, hard resolve settled over Elias. The conflict that had been tearing him apart, the impossible choice, vanished, replaced by a single, unwavering purpose. It wasn't about choosing Miriam or choosing Celia. It was about choosing them both. It was about standing between them and the brutal, unforgiving world. He strode into the circle. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The two drovers turned, surprised. They saw Elias, his tall frame blocking the sun, his face set like granite. They knew him. They knew his reputation as a quiet, hard-working man who kept to himself. They also knew the look of a man who had been pushed past his limit. "This ain't your business, Thorn," the first one grumbled, though his bravado had lost its edge. "You're making it my business," Elias said, his gaze as cold as a winter river. "Let the man go. Now." They hesitated for a moment, sizing him up. They saw no fear in his eyes, only a certainty that was more intimidating than any threat. Muttering under their breath, they backed away, melting back into the crowd. Elias helped Peterson out of the trough, his mind 1,000 miles away. He had seen his path. It was a hard path, a lonely one, but it was the only one a decent man could walk. The ride home was different. He was no longer running. He was riding toward his decision, his purpose clear. He arrived as dusk was painting the prairie in shades of purple and orange. He found both women in the main room, sitting in their customary silence. They looked up as he entered, their faces etched with weary apprehension. He didn't take off his hat. He stood before the hearth, the heart of the home, and looked at them both. "I'm done with the silence," he said, his voice clear and steady. "And I'm done with the running." He looked at Miriam, his gaze direct and filled with a deep, quiet respect. "Miriam, I sent for you with the object of matrimony. I am a man of my word. If you will still have me, I will be your husband." Miriam stared at him, her lips parted in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. Before she could speak, Elias turned his gaze to Celia. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of dread and a sliver of hope. "Celia," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you will not be leaving. Miriam's place is here, as my wife, and your place is here, as her sister. This ranch, this house, this is your home too, for as long as you want it. You are family, and I will protect my family." He had not chosen one over the other. He had chosen the unit, the broken, beautiful, three-part thing they had become. He would build a wall around them with his name, his body, and his will, and he would dare the world to try and tear it down. The decision settled in the quiet room. It was not a happy ending. It was a radical, terrifying beginning. The news of it spread through redemption like a prairie fire. It was carried on the lips of the drovers, whispered over fences, and debated in the mercantile. Elias Thorn, the quiet widower, had lost his mind. He was taking in damaged goods. Everyone knew that. And now, he was taking them both. The talk was ugly, the judgment swift. They gave him a new name in town. They called him the madman of the plains, the rancher who had taken 2 wives. Elias heard the whispers, but he did not care. He had made his choice. He had built his ark. Now, the 3 of them would have to learn to survive the flood. Elias's declaration, delivered with the flat finality of a nail hammered into hardwood, did not bring peace. It brought a stunned, disbelieving silence, a quiet so profound that the hiss of the fire in the hearth sounded like a roar. He had built an ark, but his 2 passengers stood on the deck in a state of shock, unsure if they had been saved or simply condemned to a more intimate and complicated form of exile. The days that followed were a masterclass in awkwardness. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken questions and misplaced courtesies. Miriam was now, by his decree, his wife. Yet she felt like a fraud. She performed the duties of a wife, mending his clothes, preparing his meals, ensuring the home was kept in order, but she did so with the air of a hired servant who was terrified of being dismissed. When he spoke to her, she would startle, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a heartbreaking gratitude that made him feel like a tyrant. He had given her his name as a shield, but in doing so, he had inadvertently highlighted the chasm between a true, heartfelt union and this desperate, pragmatic arrangement. She felt his pity like a brand on her skin, and it shamed her. She was his wife, but she was not his partner. She slept in her small room, a married virgin, separated from her husband by a thin wall and a universe of trauma. Celia's predicament was even more tangled. She was not a wife, nor was she merely a sister-in-law. She was an anchor, the living, breathing reason this could never be a normal marriage. She felt the crushing weight of her own presence. She had offered herself to Elias, and he had refused her, choosing instead the woman she both loved and resented. Yet he had also commanded her to stay, binding her to the very situation that caused her such pain. She was a constant reminder of the past, the third point of a miserable triangle. She tried to make herself useful, but her efforts were clumsy and forced. She would see Elias speaking quietly to Miriam and feel a sharp, bitter pang of jealousy. Then she would be consumed by guilt, because the woman he was speaking to was the same one who had sacrificed everything for her. So she tried to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible, her vibrant energy collapsing inward into a black hole of confusion and self-recrimination. Elias was not a fool. He saw their turmoil, felt their uncertainty in the very air he breathed. He had made a stand, but a stand was not a home. A declaration was not a family. He knew that words were cheap. Trust, the currency they so desperately needed, had to be earned through action. And so, with the same quiet, methodical determination he used to run his ranch, he began the slow, arduous work of building a family from the wreckage of their lives. He started with the work. He saw how Celia felt like a guest, a burden, and how Miriam was retreating into the narrow confines of what she considered a wife's duties. One morning at breakfast, he laid out his plan. "Miriam," he began, his voice steady, "you have a gift for making this house a home. The preserving, the baking, the planning for winter. That is your domain. You will be the quartermaster of this outfit. No one is better suited." Miriam looked up, surprised, a faint flush of color rising in her cheeks. He had not just given her tasks, he had given her a title, a position of authority and respect. Then he turned to Celia. "Celia, you have an energy for the outdoors. The garden has never looked better since you arrived. The chickens are laying twice as much. From now on, the garden, the hen house, and the new vegetable patch will be clearing by the creek. That is your territory. You'll be in charge of what we grow, what we sell in town for extra coin. It's a big responsibility." It was a simple, masterful stroke. He had given them separate but equal spheres of influence. They were not rivals for the same space. They were partners in a larger enterprise. He saw a flicker of purpose return to Celia's eyes, a lessening of the tension in Miriam's shoulders. He was not just making room for them. He was carving out spaces that belonged to them alone. He went further. He made it a point to listen. He would spend time with each of them, not as a man with two women, but as a partner consulting his lieutenants. In the evenings, he would sit with Miriam at the table and go over the ledger, asking her opinion on whether to buy a new cast-iron pot or to save the money for more seed. He treated her knowledge not as a woman's intuition, but as a valuable asset to their shared survival. He listened to her soft-spoken, practical wisdom, and in doing so, he began to dismantle the wall of pity between them, replacing it with the sturdy bricks of mutual respect. With Celia, he would walk the property, letting her restless energy find an outlet. He listened as she talked, her words tumbling out in a rush, about her ideas for planting corn instead of just beans, for building a small smokehouse. He saw the sharp, practical mind that lay beneath her flighty exterior. He would nod, consider her ideas seriously, and agree to the ones that made sense. He was showing her that she was not a child to be protected or a temptation to be resisted. She was a valued contributor. a mind worthy of being heard. Slowly, painstakingly, the atmosphere in the cabin began to thaw. The brittle silence was replaced by the sounds of a functioning household. The women still rarely spoke of the past, but they began to speak of the future, of the coming winter, of the spring planting. They began to work together, their separate domains bleeding into one another. Celia would bring in a basket of vegetables and ask for Miriam's advice on the best way to pickle them. Miriam, in turn, would save the best table scraps for Celia's chickens. They were rebuilding their bond, not on the cracked foundation of their shared trauma, but on the new, solid ground of their shared purpose. Elias watched them, a quiet satisfaction settling in his heart. He had not fixed what was broken inside them. He knew he never could, but he had given them a place where they might begin to heal. The turning point came one cold night in late autumn. A fierce wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound that made the small cabin feel like the only bastion of warmth and light in the world. The day's work was done. A stew simmered on the hearth, filling the room with a savory aroma. The three of them sat before the fire, not speaking, but sharing the comfortable silence of tired laborers. Elias was mending a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly deft. Miriam was darning a sock, her needle moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Celia was just watching the flames, her face thoughtful in the flickering light. For a long time, the only sounds were the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the soft scrape of Elias's knife against the leather. Then, Celia spoke, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. "Miriam," she said. Miriam looked up from her sewing, her expression questioning. Celia's gaze was fixed on the fire, but her words were for her sister. "I was thinking today, if Elias hadn't answered your letter, if he hadn't let us stay, I don't think I could have gone on. I was at the end of my rope. I think I would have just given up." The admission was stark, and it hung in the air with a terrible weight. Elias's hand stilled. Celia then turned her head, her gaze shifting from the fire to meet Miriam's eyes directly. Her own eyes were shining with unshed tears, but her voice was steady, filled with a certainty that was absolute. "Without Elias," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I don't think I would have survived. But Miriam, without you, I wouldn't have been alive in the first place." The simple, powerful truth of that statement settled over the room, changing everything. It was not a competition, it was a definition. Elias was the harbor, the sturdy wall against the storm, but Miriam was life itself. She was the one who had held the pieces of Celia's shattered soul together with nothing but her own fierce, sacrificial love. It was a validation of Miriam's entire existence, an acknowledgement from the one person whose opinion mattered most that her terrible sacrifices had not been in vain. Elias looked at Miriam and saw a single tear trace a silent path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. For the first time, he understood the full, breathtaking scope of what she had done. He was their protector, but she was their savior. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. The dam of restraint had been broken, and a new, profound emotional current flowed between the three of them. They were no longer just a rancher and two refugees. They were a unit, bound by a truth that had finally been spoken aloud. Later that night, Elias lay in his bed, the weight of Celia's words still heavy on his mind. The wind had died down, and a profound stillness had settled over the prairie. He heard a sound, the soft click of a latch. He turned his head and saw his door swing inward. It was Miriam. She stood in the doorway, a slim silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering in from the main room. She wore her simple white nightgown, her dark hair unbraided and falling around her shoulders. He had never seen her so undone, so vulnerable. Her eyes, even in the dim light, were luminous, filled with an emotion he had never seen in them before, not fear, not sorrow, not even gratitude. It was something else entirely. It was intention. She closed the door behind her, the sound a soft, final punctuation mark. She walked slowly toward the bed, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Her gaze said everything. The fireplace conversation had unlocked something deep within her. Celia's words had given her permission to be more than just a survivor, more than just a protector. Elias's declaration had made her a wife in name. Tonight, she was claiming the title for herself, not out of duty, and not because he had pitied her, but because she was a woman with a heart that had been frozen for years and was, at long last, beginning to thaw. She stopped at the side of his bed. He sat up, his own heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He saw the trembling in her hands, the profound vulnerability in her eyes, and he was filled with a tenderness so fierce it ached. This was not the same as the desperate, sorrowful coupling he had shared with Celia. This was something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more terrifying. This was an act of profound and courageous trust. She reached out a hesitant hand and laid it on his arm. Her touch was cool, but a current of warmth flowed from it, spreading through his entire body. In that moment, he ceased to be her protector. He was simply her husband. He lifted the blanket, an invitation, and she came to him. It was a night of quiet revelations. In his arms, Miriam unfolded. The years of fear, of holding herself rigid against the cruelty of the world, fell away. She let go of the sorrow and the shame that she had carried for so long, and in its place, a lifetime of buried tenderness and unspent passion rose to the surface. She was not the timid, haunted woman he had known, but a woman of deep, quiet passions. A woman who had been starved for a gentle touch, for a safe place to lay her head. It was a slow, emotional consummation, a mending of things long broken, a silent promise whispered in the dark. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the prairie, they lay tangled together. The silence in the room no longer empty, but full of a new, fragile understanding. They were not a normal couple. They would never be a normal family. Their love was not a thing of neat lines and simple definitions. It was a complex, sprawling thing, born of violence and necessity, nurtured by patience, and finally, irrevocably, blooming in the shared darkness. And as Elias held his wife, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this strange, three-person family was not a mistake or a compromise. It was his destiny, and for the first time, he did not feel the weight of it as a burden, but as a privilege. They could not live without each other. Not any of them. They were three broken pieces that, when fitted together, somehow, impossibly, made a whole. The night Miriam came to Elias, a new quiet settled in the small cabin. It was not the silence of sorrow or the silence of tension, but the deep, still calm that follows a long and brutal war, the unconditional surrender of the heart. From that night forward, the geometry of their lives shifted into a new and unnamed shape. It was a shape that had no place in the neat, four-square world beyond their property line. But within the walls of the cabin and the vast expanse of their land, it felt as natural and as necessary as breathing. Life found its rhythm. It was a three-part harmony, sung in the key of survival. Miriam was the steady, grounding bass note. She was Elias's wife in every sense of the word, sharing his bed, his counsel, and the quiet burdens of his heart. The act of physical intimacy had unlocked a deep well of tenderness in her, and the haunted look in her eyes was slowly, day by day, replaced by a soft, watchful warmth. She was the heart of the home, the center of their gravity. Celia was the melody, the bright, resilient thread of life that wove through their days. The shame and confusion that had plagued her after her night with Elias had been burned away by the fires of confession and acceptance. She was no longer a rival or a third wheel. She was simply Celia, Miriam's sister, Elias's charge, and an indispensable part of the whole. She found her purpose in the earth, her hands in the soil, coaxing life from the stubborn prairie ground. her laughter, which had been absent for so long, returned. Not the brittle, nervous sound of before, but a genuine, full-throated joy that would rise up from the garden and drift in through the open cabin door. A sound as welcome as the song of a meadowlark. And Elias was the foundation upon which this strange and beautiful structure was built. He was husband, protector, and partner. He moved between the two women with an easy, unconscious grace, his affection for them a constant, steadying force. It was in the way he brought Miriam the first wildflower of spring, a silent acknowledgement of the beauty she had brought back into his life. It was in the way he built a new, sturdy workbench for Celia in the corner of the barn, respecting her domain and her work. He shared his bed with Miriam, but he shared his days with them both. The three of them would work side by side mending a fence, their movements falling into an unspoken syncopation, a shared language of labor and purpose. They were a closed circle, a self-contained world. Their love for one another a thing that could not be named by any conventional word, for it was a mixture of marital devotion, familial loyalty, and the fierce, unbreakable bond of fellow survivors. The world outside, of course, did not approve. The town of Redemption passed its judgment swiftly and without mercy on their infrequent trips for supplies. The trio was met with a wall of cold shoulders and hostile stares. Women would pull their children closer as they passed, whispering behind their hands. Men at the saloon would fall silent, their eyes following Elias with a mixture of contempt and a crude, prurient curiosity. The whispers followed them everywhere, the thorn anomalies, the madman and his damaged women, but the whispers never reached their ears. Elias had become a fortress. His presence beside them was an unspoken challenge to the entire town. He was a large man, and quiet, but a new hardness had settled in his eyes, a look that promised swift and decisive action against any man foolish enough to voice his contempt. On one occasion, a drunken fool at the mercantile had muttered a low, ugly word as Celia passed. Elias had not raised his voice. He had simply stopped, turned, and fixed the man with a gaze so cold and so full of deadly intent that the man had paled, stammered an apology, and fled the store. After that, the insults ceased. The judgment remained, a permanent, frigid wall between their ranch and the town. But no one dared to throw stones at them again. Their isolation was complete, but within it, they were safe. For 2 years, this strange peace held. They prospered. The cattle grew fat. Celia's garden produced a bounty they could sell for extra coin in a neighboring town where they were not known, and the small cabin was filled with a quiet, hard-won contentment. And then the sky turned against them. It began in the spring. The rains that should have come to soften the earth for planting were little more than a miserly sprinkle, barely enough to dampen the dust. Summer arrived with a hot, relentless fury. The sun was not a life-giving orb, but a malevolent brass eye in a bleached, cloudless sky. The creek that ran through their property dwindled to a muddy trickle and then disappeared altogether. The prairie grass, usually a sea of green, turned a sickly yellow, then a brittle, lifeless brown. The earth itself began to crack, great fissures opening in the baked soil like wounds on a dying animal. A great and terrible thirst settled over the land. The drought was a slow, merciless siege. The well, their lifeline, grew shallower each day. The water they drew was tinged with mud and tasted of the deep, dry earth. Their cattle grew thin, their ribs stark beneath their hides as they wandered listlessly in search of non-existent pasture. Celia's garden withered and died. The plants blackened and crisped by the relentless sun as if they had been touched by fire. The cheerful sounds of their life were replaced by the grim silence of a daily battle for survival. Every drop of water was precious, rationed between the animals and themselves. Every mouthful of food was a reminder of their dwindling supplies. The strain began to show on their faces. Elias grew leaner, the lines around his eyes deepening with worry. Celia's laughter was a memory, her energy consumed by the hopeless. back-breaking work of trying to keep a few hardy plants alive. Miriam's quiet strength was tested to its limit, her face a constant mask of worry as she watched their stores of preserved food shrink with alarming speed. The drought was not just an external force, it was an invasion, seeping into the cabin, threatening to crack the very foundations of the family they had built. They were losing. One evening, as they sat around the table with a meager meal of beans and dried corn, Elias laid the hard truth bare. "The well will be dry within a fortnight," he said, his voice heavy. "The last of the hay is almost gone. If we don't get water and feed, we'll lose the rest of the stock. And if we lose the stock, we lose the ranch." They were on the precipice of ruin, the home they had fought so hard to build about to be swept away by a tide of dust. In the silence that followed, a new resolve settled over them. They had survived Madame Evangeline. They had survived the judgment of the world. They would not be beaten by a rainless sky. The next morning, Miriam came to Elias, her face pale but determined. In her hands, she held the simple wedding veil he had bought for her, a small square of white lace that was her only material link to their union, her only proof that she was more than the woman from St. Louis. "In the next town over, there is a man who hauls water from the mountains for a price," she said, her voice steady. "Sell this. It should be enough for a few barrels. It will keep the breeding stock alive for another week." Elias looked at the veil, his heart aching. It was her most prized possession. "Miriam, no, I can't let you." "You must," she said, pressing it into his hand. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw a strength that humbled him. "A piece of lace is nothing. The water is everything. Our home is everything." That same day, Celia, who had overheard, came to him with 2 of her best dresses bundled in her arms. "The wife of the blacksmith in Redemption. She has always admired my sewing," she said, her own voice taking on a new, hard pragmatism. "I will tell her I can mend and make clothes. It won't be much, but it will be enough to buy a few sacks of feed." He protested again, but she cut him off. "Miriam is right," she said. "We are in this together. My pride is not worth the life of a single calf." And so the sacrifices began. Elias rode out and sold the veil, the transaction feeling like a betrayal. Celia walked the long, dusty miles to town and swallowed her pride, offering her services as a common seamstress to the women who whispered behind her back. But it was not enough. The money they earned was a trickle against a flood of need. The drought held its grip, tightening its fist around them. Finally, Elias knew what he had to do. He had heard that the railroad, pushing its way west, was hiring men for blasting and laying track 100 miles to the south. The work was dangerous, the pay barely enough to live on, but it was cash. It was their only hope. The thought of leaving the women alone, unprotected, was a torment, but the thought of staying and watching them all starve was worse. He told them his plan that night. He saw the fear in their eyes, a fear they both tried to hide from him. "We will be all right, Elias," Miriam said, her hand finding his across the table. "We are stronger than you think." "Just come back," Celia whispered, her voice small. "I will always come back," he promised, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "This is my home." He left before dawn the next morning, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. As he rode away, he looked back and saw them standing in the doorway of the cabin, 2 small, determined figures silhouetted against the rising sun, watching him go. The weeks that followed were the hardest of their lives. Elias worked from sunup to sundown in a brutal, sun-scorched canyon, his body aching, his spirit sustained only by the thought of the 2 women waiting for him. He sent back every penny he could spare with a traveling preacher. Back at the ranch, Miriam and Celia carried on, their lives stripped down to the barest essentials of survival. They managed the water, cared for the few remaining animals, and protected the homestead with a fierce, shared resolve. They were a skeleton crew, running on nothing but grit and their unwavering faith in each other. And then, one evening, it happened. A change. The air, which had been hot and stagnant for months, began to stir. A single, dark cloud appeared on the western horizon, then another and another. A deep, bruised purple began to spread across the sky. The wind picked up, carrying with it a scent they had almost forgotten, the cool, clean smell of rain. Miriam and Celia came out of the cabin, standing side by side, their faces turned toward the sky. They didn't dare to hope. They had been disappointed too many times. But then, a low, distant rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. A flash of lightning illuminated the growing bank of clouds. The wind began to whip their skirts, pulling the pins from their hair. And then, the first drop fell. It landed on Celia's outstretched hand, a dark, perfect circle in the dust on her skin. She looked at it, her eyes wide with disbelief. Another fell, landing on Miriam's cheek, mingling with the tear that was already there. And then the sky opened. It was not a gentle shower. It was a deluge, a great cleansing torrent that hammered the tin roof of the barn and turned the cracked earth to a sea of mud. The two women did not run for shelter. They stood in the downpour, lifting their faces to the heavens, letting the rain wash away the dust and the fear and the despair. They began to laugh. Great, gasping peals of pure, unadulterated joy. They grabbed each other's hands and danced in the glorious, life-giving mud, their laughter mingling with the roar of the storm. The drought was broken. It was a baptism. It was a promise. It was the forgiveness of God. Elias returned a month later to a transformed world. The prairie was coming back to life, a faint blush of green spreading across the brown hills. The creek was running again. The well was full. He found Miriam and Celia not just surviving, but thriving. The hardship had not broken them. It had forged them into something stronger, harder, and more beautiful than before. The story of their strange family closes not in a moment of high drama, but on a quiet afternoon the following spring. The world was green and full of promise. Elias, Miriam, and Celia stood together at the edge of the yard, near the road leading to the house. In their hands were 3 small saplings, the beginnings of cottonwood trees. One by one, they planted them, digging into the soft, dark earth, setting the young trees in a straight, proud line. They were not just planting trees, they were putting down roots, their roots, a marker for all the world to see, a testament to their survival, a promise to their future. They were a family, forged in secrets and sealed in sacrifice, a family that did not look like any other, but was more real, more true than anything any of them had ever known. That evening, as the sun set, Elias took his sharpest knife and stood before the door of the small cabin that had become their entire world. He worked for a long time, the scrape of the blade on the wood a soft, deliberate sound in the twilight. When he was finished, he had carved a motto into the lintel above the door, a creed for their unconventional and unbreakable clan. The words were simple, and they were the truest thing he had ever known. Family is where you dare to love, though the world hates you for it. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're always so grateful to have you with us on this journey into the past. We'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Please let us know in the comments below. It's a wonderful way for us all to connect. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel and sharing your thoughts.